B. Frank Network. Content on this production is for entertainment and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice, nor is it intended to substitute medical treatment or diagnosis. Seek medical help if you believe that you are suffering from a mental illness or are a threat to yourself or others. By using any or all of the information provided, you do so at your own risk. Any application of the material is at the listener's discretion and is his or her sole responsibility.
Everybody, Doc Brian here, and welcome to Doc Talks, where we talk about people's troubles, trials, tribulations, and hopefully triumphs in life. Today with me, I have Sergio Chicon. Did I say it right? Chicon?
Chicon.
Okay, I told you. I knew that I was going to say it wrong. Chicon with us today, and you are a personal trainer and stand-up comic.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, I heard somebody say one time that they were a stand-up comic and they did shows, which meant they were unemployed and did comedy on the side. It kind of seems to be that way sometimes.
Right. That makes sense. But, I am fortunate that I am able to make a living out of two things I really enjoy. Those are my passions, and it is kind of to be something I can make a living doing. So I'm very fortunate and grateful for that,
It's always fulfilling when we can do something that we truly enjoy.
Absolutely. Yeah. It also feels like I'm at service to others, which is nice.
Absolutely.
So it feels like I'm giving back. So that's nice as well.
So tell me a little bit, where were you born and what was life growing up as a child?
I was born in New York City, Lower East Side, Manhattan. From the age of 1 to 10, I grew up in the projects in Baruch, single mom with my sister. And that neighborhood, when I was starting to hit like 9 or 10, I started to experience like bullies and like street violence, and I remember the last year or two in that neighborhood, I would just like stay home. I was like a hermit. I did not want to interact with some of the kids outside because they were violence. And my mother was part of a homesteading program in which you actually physically help build a building, help gut it, assist in gutting it, and then you get a share. You get a share, and she did that for like 5-6 long years. My mother did that for 5-6 long years before we finally moved into that neighborhood, which is only like a 15-minute walk. But that neighborhood was different. It was a little more diverse. There was like, so the Baruch projects where I originally grew up was mostly Black and Latino. And when we moved to a different area, what they call Alphabet City, Manhattan, was a little more diverse. These were like more tenement housing, a lot of drugs and violence in that neighborhood, but it was definitely, I seen a lot. I was introduced to more of a punk rock culture, more artsy East Village culture, if I may, At that age, I became a little more outgoing and stuff, but all through that time, 10 to 15, 16, mid-teens, I experienced a lot of, street violence. There was always drugs around. There was always drugs being sold, used in front of me. At a very young age, I was exposed to a lot of that stuff. But I wasn't like an unhappy kid. I was, always joking around. I had a lot of friends, but I always felt the need to protect myself or shelter myself from that sort of action. Like I did everything I could to avoid it.
Right.
And it wasn't always avoidable.
So at what point in time did you really realize that, hey, this is violence and this is drugs? When did that really set in with you that this isn't good?
So at a very young age, I remember the most traumatic experience I had with violence. The first fight I had like a rival. Like it was like a first or second grade. I remember feeling really good about that fight because I would win, right? And it was energizing. But I remember this one time shortly after that, I must have been like 9 or 10 years old, a group of kids, I was on my way home, and it was the first time I could recall that I went against my intuition. When you get that gut instinct of danger and to avoid it, you either walk across the street or, do something. I didn't do that. What I did was I faced it head on And I knew that I was going to a fire. It just felt like it was something wrong. And sure enough, like the kids beat me up, they punched me in the face, and that was traumatic. Like I didn't want to deal with that. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know why someone would want to do that. And I felt like once that happened, I was a magnet to that sort of energy. And I was young. I was like 9 or 10 years old. So as far as violence is concerned, I knew that was like, oh, that's a thing. There's kids out here who are nasty. As far as drugs are concerned, I've seen drugs around being used recreationally. And I think I had more of initially more of a glorified element to it, a fun element, a social element to it that seemed intriguing and it seemed like a lot of fun. So I was curious at a very young age.
Right. So at that first fight that you had, you said it kind of made you a magnet to that kind of controversy. From that point on, did you find yourself to be in more of those situations, or did you try to remove yourself from that construct and be somewhere else when those kind of things were happening?
I did everything in my power to get away from it. If I see kids that look like like trouble, I would cross the street. I would pretend I was tying my shoelace, even though I was wearing sandals. Like, anything I could do to avoid it.
Any coping mechanism would do just to get out of that situation.
And I did the same thing with school. I was, I wasn't a tough kid that really knew how to fight or had aggressive energy. So I wanted to avoid that. And the same thing with school. There was something I wasn't good at in school, and I wasn't like a bad student early on. I read well. And I enjoyed history and everything. But when it came to math, I did everything in my power to avoid that. I would pretend I was sick. I would, just everything. It would be extreme, actually, just to get out of doing it.
Right. So you'd mentioned that you grew up with your mom, who was a single mom. Do you know your father at all?
Yes. He lived in Florida, and I would visit him as a young boy. I would fly out there by myself. 6, 7 years old, go on a flight. And my memory of him is vague. He would take me a few weeks or so in the summer, but he would leave me alone in the apartment while he hung out all day. And what he did all day was drink and hang out with his friends and drugs or whatever. So my memory of him at home was usually him being moody and just watching TV, or when he came home at night, drunk from from his outing. And then the memories that I do have that were enjoyable was him taking me to, he used to take me to cockfights, like rooster. And that's such a violent, have you ever been to one?
I've never been to one, but I've like seen them on YouTube. So
yeah. They're pretty intense and they're nasty, but to this day, when I hear about it, there's a certain warmth that's brought to me with that violence because it attaches the bond that we had.
Right. Isn't it amazing how our minds can attach to certain oddities that just bring back memories of things?
Right.
It's it's not always the good thing. I remember I was playing baseball. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and we had this big baseball tournament coming up. And I grew up in a poor family, and this afternoon we went to a Kentucky Fried Chicken, and this was back in the day where they had the big buffet. I don't know if you know it. Do they have Kentucky Fried Chicken in New York?
They do, but it's not a buffet. It's more like you order it and you get it in the bucket or something like that. Not a buffet.
So we were eating this buffet meal, and this lady comes in and starts a fight with the manager, like a literal fist fight. And to this day, when I eat Kentucky Fried Chicken, I immediately attach that to violence. Like it's this anxiety dwells up in me of being this little kid in a booth thinking we're all going to die. That's kind of one of those things. So yeah,
it's interesting that you say that because I have something like that too that's attached to a feel good food, and it's the ice cream truck, the Mr. Softy truck.
Mm-hmm.
The song that goes on.
Yeah,
the truck pulls up, like that bell.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear that reminds me of summer days when everyone was out in the street. And I always feel like violence is right around the corner.
Right.
And that ice cream truck was always playing when something bad went down.
Yeah. And so it gives you this sense of anxiety that something bad is about to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And even though as adults now we know that we could kind of, well, I mean, you're a boxing instructor, you could handle yourself, right? But you know, we have this kind of sense of security, but at the same time, it's like something bad is about to happen. It's weird and magical how our brains work in that way.
Absolutely.
So moving into like middle school, high school, what was life like then?
Middle school, high school, it was the same thing. I was popular amongst my peers because I've always had a good sense of humor, a creative way of like expressing myself. So I think people took a liking towards me. But I've also, I don't want to say bullying tactics, but like making fun of other people as a way to boost myself up. So when you're young and you're able to contend verbally with what they call snaps, making fun of the other person for what their shoes they're wearing or whatever, you know, you're kind of propped up. So I got by with some of that stuff in middle school. That's when I was exposed to more organized, like smaller crews and gangs. So rather than being focused on studies, it was more like I was immersed into like the hip hop culture. I love music. I was just really getting into girls. And, but I was also in a neighborhood where I knew there was a lot of different crews. There was a lot of different, and a lot of energy was spent trying to avoid confrontation with them. So I did everything, you know, I hung out with certain people, and I just felt like there's so much energy was put into that. You know, there's a lot of energy put into, you know, upholding a certain image, you know, and I was still myself for the most part, but a lot of time was spent trying to put on a certain look and exterior to avoid clashing with some of these guys. And I even joined it wasn't a gang per se, but it was an organization called a Zulu Nation. And they were originally founded by hip hop pioneers. But in a lot of ways, people may consider them a gang because they were groups of guys who used to meet bi-weekly or weekly, and we used to meet in the park and study the lessons. You know, the lessons would be every letter in the alphabet had a meaning. And a lot of these guys in the nation were violent. And they did but there was also a very positive side. They would encourage reading. They would encourage you to read certain books. But I like that power. We wore this flag, and that flag meant that you weren't to be messed with, and that felt good. That felt real good.
Do you think you were able to, as you put it, snap back to these kids because you knew that you had backup if you needed it, or was it more just a comedic way of trying to make friends?
I think it was more of a comedic way to make friends because I wasn't relentless. I didn't do it to everybody. You know, I did it, when provoked, and I was just good at doing it. So I was creative with breaking down, the characteristics of something that they did, or, a physical or, flaw or something, and I made it funny. But I don't think I was relentless to the point where I was like a bully with it, but it was definitely a skill.
Do you think it was a coping skill to try to make friends and try to feel included?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Once I seen the power of being able to have people on my side laughing and, and being a part of, like that meant they weren't laughing at me, it was like, so I would do that to teachers that would allow me to get away with it. I would, so I was a pain in the ass in middle school. I was a real.
I think we all were to some degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So being included in this, I don't really want to call it a gang. Maybe a friendship circle would be.
Yeah,
better.
it wasn't a gang per se. Like, I mean, some may consider it a gang, but it was more of a friendship circle. Wait, talking about the Zulu Nation, what I said earlier?
Right.
Yeah, because I don't know. I think when you think of gangs, I've never seen any of these guys pull out a weapon. They didn't initiate people in by beating them up, or when you wanted to leave, they didn't, you didn't get beat up to get out. So it wasn't like that.
Right. So it was more of a kind of a big brother type organization.
Yeah.
Of where you knew that people had your back, even to a fault, if you will, if it came to that. But there was also encouragement to be educated
Right.
within this thing. So how did that mold you as a young person to see that there were people like you that didn't want the violence, but if it came to that would back you up, but then really did care about you as an individual and your learning.
It went along with my mother's teachings, right? My mother was always a fighter in her own right, and she wasn't the traditional, traditionalist, like, oh, you have to, she encouraged schooling, but she always encouraged reading. She said, as long as you have your books and you're learning about the world, you're going to be rich with knowledge, and that you'll be able to navigate throughout the world. She always implemented at a very young age. I remember, she always read, and she always encouraged that, that I read. Buy me books, and it'd be like a year or two before I would pick up the book, but I always eventually read the books that she got me. Those lessons that were planted early on for my mom, they kind of the group, the organization reinstated that a little bit, like always read, we're gonna have knowledge of self, and then so forth. So it's familiar to me.
Right. Because if you can read, then you can learn, and if you learn, you can do anything.
Right.
It's kind of funny, though, how that is kind of tilted now to where kids are, if I can watch it on YouTube, I can learn, and if I can learn, I can do. And I think that's because kids nowadays are so much more visual than being able to sit down and read something. So moving into, I think what you said, seventh grade on, you were not a very good student.
No,
So what happened there that kind of made that change?
I was way behind in math. So you got to pass all the subjects to move on. So I did everything in my power to cheat and get the grades or whatever. And I made it to eighth grade. And then eighth grade, I barely made it to ninth. How I made it to ninth is beyond me. I think they had too many students, they couldn't leave anyone back. And then I made it to ninth. And then I went to high school. And like, I really didn't graduate junior high school. Like, I remember it was like a situation where it's like, you have way too many pink slips. You do what you want here, but we need to like move on. We're not gonna leave you back because school's overcrowded. It was something along those lines. I remember feeling very upset about it and feeling like a black sheep. While everyone celebrated graduated from junior high school, I remember showing up to meet my friends. They were in their cap and gown. They were going to McDonald's or, a BBQ. And I remember wearing a hat to the side and kind of embracing that, being the outcast. And I remember being very negative that day with their accomplishments. They're celebrating their accomplishment. And I remember being very moody and negative. I do remember that vividly.
So do you feel like you were just kind of pushed through instead of earning it?
Absolutely.
Right.
There's no doubt about it. I was kind of pushed through. And that got progressively worse, my schooling. Like this junior high school was just, and then high school was a joke. Like I just hung out all the time. And, once again, I kept up with my studies. I always immersed myself in reading books that I enjoyed. And it will be everything from the Cuban Revolutionary to books on animals to, Black history, all that stuff. I always read. And I enjoyed writing as well.
So it was always a nonfiction type genre that you stuck in.
Right. I've read I read a few Stephen King and Lord of the Rings stuff, and I enjoyed those for the most part. But one and done. Right. I never went through the whole series, but I've always enjoyed, figures like Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, the Dalai Lama. Bobby Seale from the Black Panthers, Huey Newton. All that stuff really caught my attention.
Mm-hmm. So within reading that history and non-fictional stuff, do you feel like that gave you a different viewpoint of the world?
Absolutely. I felt like I was fed initially, what was given to me during my everyday life, I understood from a deeper perspective, from a different lens. No doubt about it. I saw things from a different angle. I internalized people's feelings on a different level, and I really gained empathy and curiosity, really, and enthusiasm for living.
Right. So in reading all of this history, What was the one thing that really kind of stuck out to you as some of the greatest, most accomplished things that you read?
Well, one thing that I would say, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, but one thing that when you ask me that question, what pops out?
Hmm.
I remember Che Guevara sacrificing the life that was kind of laid out before him. He was a doctor, and he could have been a very successful doctor in Argentina. But when he finished his studies, he decided to get a motorbike with his friend and cruise down South America with his skills of a doctor and help tend and mend to people who were ill. And he did that for free. And I always thought that was a beautiful, selfless act.
Yeah. So did that ever inspire you to do something great with your life?
I don't know if it inspired me to read more on that and always I don't know, I guess put the energy into always remaining generous and treating people as equals and never having a feeling like you're inferior to me. Like, I've always practiced try to keep a level head and like not to have an ego about things. That it could kind of blind you.
Absolutely. So in moving into graduation of high school, did you have dreams of going on to college, or were you just, okay, I'm done with education?
Yeah, I never had any dreams or thoughts of going to college. I've always enjoyed working. So at a very young age, I always worked. And just rewinding back to like my junior high school days, I met a guy, an antique salesman, but he was a hustler. So he was, well traveled, and he would pick up antiques. He had an eye for it, and he would sell it. And he was so charismatic. He was so engaging. He would put on music in his little shop, and he would have all the neighborhood kids around there. He had a pit bull that like ran up and down the block, and he would give us $5 to give out a stack of flyers. But the way he was able to communicate with anybody, whether it be a street dude to, a 9-to-5er, to a finance person, to a blue collar worker, I was always impressed by that. He had the gift to gab, and he was so passionate about his furniture, right? And he spoke about it like it was the last piece and that you needed that piece. So I liked that salesmanship, and it was showmanship. He was really performing it. And he always had some good music playing in the back. And so he, and he's still alive, and I would love to eventually have him as a guest on my podcast. He was always someone who stuck with me because he was like a hard worker, sweating all the time, pushing the furniture. So that's one person who was outside of my family that worked hard. My mother was a hard worker too. She had 2 to 3 jobs at a time. The fact that she got us out the project and she physically helped build and restore this building for 6 long years to own this apartment, that's a display of hard work.
Absolutely.
And commitment. And she did that for us. She did that for us. And there was a lot of sacrifice. There was a lot of times that me and my sister were at home alone, But I saw that. My mother always worked hard. She was diligent, and she walked even at the lowest places where her head held high. Always very proud.
Thinking about the sacrifice that your mother made there, can you put into words how that made you feel, that she sacrificed all of that for you and your sister?
I think it's a beautiful thing, and it's and I hope that I represent that as a parent as well to my daughter. When it comes to sacrifice, I don't want to do it with that with the attitude or even the face of like I sacrifice, or that energy. It's like, oh no, this is what I want to do. It's a sacrifice, but it's like this is what my heart and spirit wants me to do.
Right.
It doesn't come from a place like, oh, I sacrifice for you. It doesn't feel like that. I'm so full of love and this openness that's like, oh, this is what I want to do. And if certain things have to put aside, those things are trivial compared to the bigger picture. And that's, my daughter, that's my wife, that's the things I love, So it doesn't really seem like a sacrifice, but we all sacrifice.
Absolutely. So whenever anybody says, I sacrificed for you, or I did this for you, then you can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that they didn't do it for you. They did it for them so that they could feel good about what they have done.
Right.
So yeah, but it's so easy sometimes to slip into that mindset, especially when we feel like somebody's betrayed us in what we have done.
Right.
So getting out of school into being a young person, I believe you said you had some substance abuse problems. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
My daughter's just walking by grabbing her stuff. You almost done?
Yeah.
She's fine. Does she want to make a guest appearance?
Well, yeah. Charlie, why don't you say hello to Dr. B?
Hi.
Hi.
Did you hear her?
I heard her.
Give him a little wave. Come over here real quick. This is my beautiful daughter, Charlie.
Oh, she is beautiful. Hi, Charlie.
Hi.
I love you, baby.
It's always good to have our kids around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when the first I've seen drugs being used at a very young age. So now, weed and drinking, age 6, 7, casually amongst family members. Always, and I was always curious about it. The first time I saw cocaine, I was visiting my father, and I might have seen it before, but the one that sticks to me. And he was I was watching the movie Howard the Duck. Remember that movie?
I do.
Such a silly movie. And I was singing the theme song, Howard the Duck. And I run into the kitchen with that 6-year-old enthusiasm, right? And I see my father holding a key to his friend's nose. Mm. And I stopped dead in my tracks. My father said, go to the room. So I go to the room. And that was it, But I remember one thing that stuck with me, that the following morning, I woke up really early, and I took my finger and I wiped it across the counter and I put it to my teeth. I was like 6, 7 years old. That's something. I don't think that was I don't think I came up with that. I think I've seen that before, probably many times over.
Sure.
But that's the one time I remember that. And like, what inspired me to do that? How did I know to do that? What sparked that curiosity? So something tells me that either I was too young or I blocked certain things out, but that was the first memory of doing that, but I probably seen it done over and over.
So what effect did it have on you when you rubbed it on your teeth? Do you remember?
Well, there was nothing there.
Oh, okay.
But I was searching for it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking at 6 years old, if you actually got some cocaine in your mouth, there's no telling what kind of animations could have taken place.
Right.
So when was the first time that you remember doing cocaine?
Oh, I remember vividly. I was, I believe, 17, 18 years old. And I was with a kid I used to go to, I was in grammar school with. He was a kid that had troubles. He was a very charismatic kid. He was well liked, but he was adopted. And I never felt like he belonged to his family. I remember he, very, very curious when it came to those things. He was always around that energy. So one time, he had mentioned that he had some, and we were at in a building in a stairway, and I remember when I did that, man, it just felt so good to express myself. Like it came out so fluidly, But I remember also feeling as if I was just talking a lot about my problems. Mm-hmm. Like it was just like pouring out. And so was he. And so we were just sitting in a stairway of some strange building, and that was it. And I liked it. I liked it a lot.
And how, you said you were 16, 17 years old?
I was like 16, 17 years old, yeah.
Yeah.
But before that, I had already started drinking. I was drinking already. I was smoking weed already.
Was it really a temptation, or was it just, hey, it's here, let's try this?
Oh, no, I was super curious. If anything, I was probably the one that was pushing for it more. Gotcha. I thought it was I was so fascinated by it. I was super curious about it. I wanted to do it. No one would twist my arm. I definitely wanted to do it.
Do you remember what made you so curious about doing it?
I don't. I just think the fact, it could have been the certain music I was listening to. It could have been the fact that I've seen family or people around me using it. I know it just had this allure about it.
Sure. So from that point on, did it become a regular thing?
It didn't become a regular thing, but I for years I would drink weekly. And that was for 3 years, like a lot of people do, right? And I never considered it a problem. Fast forward to my mid-20s when I started stand-up, everything was more, because it was socially accepted in that world. That's when it felt uncontrollable. But I guess that those bad habits were cultivated within that 10-year span, right? You think 16 to 26, it built it up steadily, and then it became unmanageable.
Sure.
Where I couldn't,
So did you find yourself doing it within the realm of comedy socially, or did you get to a point of where you had to have it in order to do a show, or you had to have it in order to try to, even though cocaine's a stimulant, to try to calm down after a show?
That's a very good question. It was a bit of all the above. So before, initially, it became something just to do after a few drinks. Then it became something to do after shows. Almost every time after shows, and anytime I did it before a show, it was a big roll of the dice. Sometimes I'd be so like that I didn't want to get on stage, or But then it got to the point where I was doing it and not even enjoying myself anymore. I would do it and just become I would almost want to be alone.
Yeah.
What became like something, what started off as something very social became, I withdrew from people.
Right. Which is not uncommon, because when one uses such a drug, they kind of get diarrhea of the mouth, I guess is the best way to say. And then they realize, I have told all of this stuff to people, and I don't want everybody to know about this. And so you kind of ostracize yourself from everybody around, or it's because your problems become more real.
Yeah.
And you're able to no longer compartmentalize all these problems. And so it leads then to further depression.
Absolutely. It got to the point where I would use and immediately start talking about quitting. So the whole high was spent, for hours on how I'm going to stop. And I would speak about it so well and passionately. Like I would articulate how I was going to do it. I had it all figured out, all while still, doing the drug, which is wild, if you think about it. And I think when you're knowledgeable about the negative of doing such drugs, on the toll it has on your physical and mental health, but then you continue to use it, it could drive you nuts, because like, why do I keep on doing this? And it becomes a very sad, lonely place where you're frustrated, and those feelings might inspire you to get clean for like 6 days, but then you can't go 7, then you start trying to rationalize why you're doing it, and you trick yourself. You try to trick yourself, telling yourself, "Oh, I'll just do it once a week," or "But I can't do that because I'm hungover for it. I'll do it once a month." I told myself I'll just do it once a month. That's 12 times a year.
Mm-hmm.
That never worked, Or I would say, unless if I always have to have $1,000 in my bank account to do it. Like these ridiculous, And when I got clean, I realized the amount of time I spent doing and recovering was phenomenal, And I wasn't even a guy who was doing it every day, but it was enough where I added up the hours. And you think about, like, if I did a show at 8 p.m. and I was done by 10, and I hung out from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., 10 to 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's 7 hours of hanging out, and then another 6 hours recovering. It's damn near like 12 hours in that one stint. You add that times 3, that's a part-time job. It's like 30 plus hours of committing, reserving for that. And those are physical hours, not even the mental toll that it takes on you.
Right. And the lack of sleep.
Right.
All of that, all of that kind of culminates into a mental health nightmare.
Right.
So tell me about the first time that you stepped on stage to do comedy and you really felt like you were in your element.
So the first time I ever did it, I went to like it was a comedy school where it's like you go weekly with your peers and you perform 5 minutes. And then there's a graduation show 10 weeks in or 6 weeks in or whatever. And that first show was phenomenal. It was at Caroline's on Broadway. I was 25, 26 years old. I was with a girlfriend I'd been for a year and a half. And my friends and family were there. And I had a 5-minute set. It was phenomenal. And I felt like so good. I felt so alive. I felt so pure. And I was addicted to stand-up. I would do it all the freaking time. I would go out to the open mics, do it 6, 7 times a night, open mic. But that, I fell in love with stand-up, that I started to fall out of love with the girl I was with. And there was a split. I mean, I started stand-up and there was definitely a split. So I think I was mad at stand-up. Like in retrospect, I look back at stand-up, I was like, damn, I gave up a lot to try to live this life. I remember, I hurt this girl's feelings. I really got into drinking and doing drugs a lot more. And there wasn't a huge payback. I mean, in retrospect, I can see what I've gained, but I could also see what it allowed and what it didn't say no to, because it was in that element. You're always in a bar, you're hanging out with people who do it. They're night owls, and so forth.
So did your girlfriend ever say, are you dating me or are you dating comedy?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, And it got to the point I felt so out of that it was comedy. And then for years, this being single, dating different people, and all while using, and it was the same scenario. It was a toxic relationships, a lot of drinking going on. Usually the person drank a lot.
And so it just kind of turns into this vicious cycle,
right,
of when is it going to end?
Right.
So what was your point in time where you said, okay, enough is enough, I have to quit?
Once I had my daughter, so my daughter's 9 years old now. Once I had her, I couldn't stand myself at that point. I was at a low. I physically could not stand myself. I was, and there's, I'm sure there's many moments, but there was this one time I was hungover and she was already born. And I woke up with a nasty hangover. It was like the sun was piercing through the blinds. I'm in a studio apartment with my now wife. We've been living in the studio apartment at the time. And my daughter was crying. My wife now, we were just boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. She knew I was really hungover, and she said, "You deal with this." And my daughter was crying. I looked. I didn't have to go far. We're in a studio apartment. Right? I looked to my right, and the crib is there. And I remember looking through the bars and seeing my daughter crying. And I remember really feeling I didn't want to deal with it. I did not want to have this going on in my life, and that was scary to me. That I felt so like resentful. And that's one thing that stuck out of me. Like, how dare I partake in this and not want to do any of the welfare? I didn't want to deal with it. And that scared me because it was such a strong feeling that I was like, if I keep up this way, I'm going to end up walking away from this or doing something worse. Like, it was so heavy. And even after that, doctor, I'll tell you, man, I went to the outpatient and I went back. And it was zigzag. It wasn't like, oh, that was the one time. It was like 6 times over in different ways. And it's not easy, to get help. You got to want it. You got to like really want to get help. And it's not easy to get help. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to really figure it out on your own. Like, there's people who will assist you, but you got to really want it, because it's not like anyone's there like, oh, you're here to get sober. Like, it's not like that. You're a fucking adult. It's a weird thing. And I didn't know where to go, really. I was trying to do it quietly, and I was going to, I was making the wrong turns. I was going to like heroin clinics. I was like, oh, this is not like my wave. And people were nasty, man. I didn't, I had, my insurance was minimum. Like, it was so a lot of people were turning me down. The help that was available to me was not plentiful. And I finally found a place that I tried 3 times over, and I finally got it the 3rd time. But props to that place. It was an outpatient thing. First I started going to 4 meetings a week, then 3 meetings, and it dwindled down. You had a counselor, you do network meetings and, group meetings, excuse me. And I slowly started to get it. But it took like a year for my confidence to come back and to get a rhythm. But then I became addicted to like working out again. I always worked out throughout this too. But I remember working out to the point where I would pee blood. Like, I was staying in the gym so long. So it was like extreme. I didn't want to talk to anybody. It was really hard to do stand-up at that time. I would go to shows and hide in the green room. Eventually everything, the chemicals like balanced out. I'm more fluid now. But It took like about a year.
So when people come to me and they say, how can I help my son, my daughter, my husband, my wife, whoever, to quit doing whatever they're addicted to, my answer is you can't. because they have to want to
Right.
in order for it to work. And because it's not easy, it's work. It is an everyday struggle. And I'm sure that even now it's a struggle for you, that there are times and temptations where you think, well, I could make it all go away, but I would lose my sobriety. And you have to
Right.
kind of weigh that. How long have you been sober now?
I got who counts the days, but it's been over 8 years.
Wow. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So now you said you kind of moved into working out, and it's interesting where people who specifically are on cocaine typically turn to working out or CrossFit or bicycling or running. All of that pent up energy that they have, they need to get out in another outlet. And that's all well and good, but there can come a point, like where you said you were urinating blood, that it's too much.
Yeah. So that was at the very beginning. And, and I couldn't sustain that. But yeah, all those things help me keep on the up and up. And it's not like I do that. Like when I run, when I box, when I work out, it's not like I got to do this because I'm running away from it. It's just, it's part of my lifestyle now.
Absolutely.
So, it doesn't feel extreme. It never becomes unmanageable. I'm never like hurting myself. So it's at a place where I was like, oh yeah, this is part of my life now. But in the beginning, it felt like that.
Right.
It felt very extreme.
So you're a boxing instructor as well.
Correct.
So the old quote, everybody has a plan until they get hit.
Right.
Did it seem like in your growing up that you had a plan until you hit rock bottom?
Absolutely.
So what would you say to those people who feel like they've got it all figured out, but they're just drowning?
I really don't. I mean, I believe to anyone who feels like they're drowning, there's always a way out. There's always an option. And I'm a firm believer in that, but you have to want it. It's one thing I think of knowing that what you're doing is wrong, but you gotta have to want it. I'm a firm believer in that. Like no one could twist your arm and make you get sober or lead a healthier, better life. I wanted it. There's no doubt about it. And with me wanting it, I still failed like many times over, but I wanted it. I couldn't be denied. I became almost like addicted to being sober. I had like a spiritual awakening. I was able to appreciate the colors that were right before my eyes. I was able to appreciate listening. I was able to appreciate what people may think is mundane. I was able to just appreciate smell and taste and just everything that's free, and nothing required like, the exchange for money for this. But for a long time, that's the way I operated. But I think I always had that in me. I just think that it was covered with, there was clutter, it was just a mess. But I felt like I always had that in me. I don't think it was that hard to uncover for me because I felt like I always had that somewhere. It wasn't something that I made up. I think it was always in me, and then I was able to reveal it again. And what I mean by that is my ability to like love and be generous with my time and not be so damn selfish. But when I was, and there was a time I was very confident, but when I started using drugs and drinking, I became selfish. It robbed me of my self-esteem. And it's ironic, right? Because I did a lot of this stuff because I thought it would give me confidence and self-esteem, but it did the exact opposite.
Absolutely.
And, so once that stuff started to come back, it became very powerful. I was like, oh, I can look at people in the eyes when I'm talking to them. I can, when faced with some sort of adversity, it doesn't have to turn into this huge controversy. If someone said no, it was no, and that was it. I move on. So it gave me peace of mind. And that's like, nothing is more valuable than that. Being able to deal with a problem and move on, not able to internalize what you think someone else may be thinking. I used to harp on things like what someone else may be thinking and spend countless hours on that, like made up things. Now I just move on. I do everything to the best of my ability, and I'm not exempt. I'm going to make mistakes and everything. But one thing I say, I have the confidence to just move on.
Yeah. One thing that I'm often quoted to say is that while everybody has an opinion, you're the only one that gets a vote.
Right.
When it comes to you.
Given the power to that, it's the most violent thing you could do to yourself.
And if you give people the power to validate what you say, you're also giving them the power to devalue everything you do.
Right.
And we give that power to people and don't even realize we've given it to them.
Right.
And then we find ourselves in the corner going, well, I wonder what they meant by that, or I wonder what they think about this. And then we become our worst advocate to try to be mentally healthy because we're always worried about what people around us are thinking or doing.
Right.
What is their agenda? What did they mean by that? And instead of just going and asking them or letting it just fly off of us, we sit there and we just let it absorb us. You know, one thing that I can appreciate that you said was that while you wanted to quit, that you still failed 3 times or 2 times.
Yeah, maybe even more.
So a lot of times we don't mention that relapse is a part of recovery. It's just normal. And so I would encourage those that may be listening that are trying to get sober just to know that failure is not final. And the acronym for fail, I believe, is first attempt in learning. So it's not final. So tell me about your what do you enjoy the most about being a boxing instructor? Because I can't imagine anything being enjoyable about getting punched in the face or the gut or anything of that nature.
So one thing, and this all goes with sobriety. Like I've always boxed, and I always was like I was in and out the gym. But once I and I did that while getting high. I remember going to the gym and, but I was telling myself I was maybe 40% of my true potential of the work I put in, how much, what I was willing to put in. And it wasn't like I was, first of all, I think let me just explain that there's a difference between being a competitive boxer and this training. And I did both, right? I trained for years, I was spar and everything. But I don't know if I ever had the confidence to really compete. But once I got sober and I really had a good grasp, the threshold for pain, both mentally and physically, I was like, oh, I can handle this. And I competed after that and won. Same thing with running. I would tell myself, I can only do 5 miles. Then I ran a marathon. It's funny how we cap off the limits of what we could do. And that's influenced by other people. If I think about it, it doesn't take me too long to people I love who always, I can't do that. It's too much. I've heard that, but you can't cap off. You'll be surprised but it requires work. Like just saying it doesn't do it. And that's what I feel like we live in a society. But if I say it enough, no, you got to do it. And doing it is it's extremely uncomfortable. And it's annoying, and it's a lonely place because no one cares about you. When you're done with it, congratulations, and that's short-lived.
Right.
But I could always tap in to that reserve, and that all applies to everything else I'm doing. When I cut my finger off on a table saw years ago, I remember the physical torment and mental anguish I went through, and I was like, if I can deal with that sort of pain, I could do stand-up and deal with that rejection. When I got off a drug and stopped drinking, I was like, if I could deal with that pain, I could do boxing and run a marathon. So it just keeps on overlapping. They're all teachings. Mm-hmm. It's all, the metaphor.
A goal without a plan is just a dream.
Right. And the thing is, I wasn't raised on, I have friends who have parents, and nothing does not knock on my mom, but I wasn't raised that way. Like, you gotta have goals. It was never like that. It was never like that. It was very, we had a lot of liberties, but I think what I try to instill my daughters, like, there have to be goals. Like, you have to write things out. And now I practice that. I have a whiteboard, and sometimes it's just daily, doctor. I'll tell you, man, sometimes it's like, today is a 5-mile run. I'm reading, writing, I'm going to Trader Joe's, just so I'm held accountable and I can check them off throughout the. It's so satisfying. Because if not, the way my mind works, I'm not saying everyone's like this, I feel like I'm all over the place. I feel like I'm on my phone for 5 minutes. I'm on the computer, and then my day feels chaotic. I write it out. And it's what people like, why did you put folding your clothes on the whiteboard? Because it needed to be done. And now it's done. Some of the goals are bigger. Sometimes, like with stand-up, I got to come up with 5 new minutes of material. But I'm always just trying to build on those blocks and trying to turn them into habits. and see what works for me and push forward from there.
I love it. I love it. So first of all, I want to say I love your shirt. It says drink some coffee, put on some gangster rap, and handle it. I mean, that could be your life mantra there. But what is one thing that you would say to anybody listening to the podcast today that is your message that you want them to know?
That's a loaded question. I think I have an appropriate answer for it. I think one thing that really pops out is that you matter. You're the most important thing. Sometimes I can't do that because of my kids. I can't do it because I got a job. No, whatever you got to do for you to get right is the most important thing. It's the most important thing. I know there's too many battles. You don't have to look too far to see some sort of social conflict you want to engage in, or maybe it's something even closer to home, right? Your child, your wife, your husband, your mother, your father. But if you're unable to get your mind and body right before you engage in those battles or assist somebody with their problems, you're not going to get very far. You have to make sure you're prepared. And what I mean by that is that you've done the work to be the best version of yourself. And that's you're constantly evolving. You're constantly going to be working on that. But you have to have a good grasp of who you are and how you move forward. You got it. Because if you do it and there's something, let's say, for example, we'll use like substance abuse going on in your life and you're not addressing that, every other battle is not going to be done with you're not going to be able to do it with the same power, enthusiasm, or longevity. And that's the inevitable. There's no way around it. So you got to put in the work to make sure you're right. You matter most. You matter most. And then from then on, because this is something that we trick ourselves to telling ourselves that, oh, I can't do that for myself because I need to help someone else. That's a cop-out. You just don't want to address that. So stop bullshitting. And that's how manipulative and sly we are with ourselves. Because that's a beautiful thing to say. It's like the whole thing, I got to sacrifice my health or my well-being because I got to do this for somebody else. No, you matter. Like, that's first and foremost. And if you don't, that means you're not putting yourself first and you don't really want to address the issues at hand. And that's an uncomfortable place. When I first got sober, what I realized is like, oh, sober is one thing. Now I gotta peel the layers back to like, why was I doing that? And that's happened to ugly things I didn't really want to admit. I didn't want to admit that I was scared, that I was insecure, that I wasn't confident in certain areas. But with vulnerability, there's strength because you're revealing it, you're putting it out there.
So you could sum it up in saying that you can't help someone else be healthy if you're not healthy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for listening to Doc Talks today. I'm Doc Brian. As we go into Doc Talks DX, the diagnosis a part of this, you can find that on Patreon, where we talk about the diagnosis and what we actually think is going on with our guests and discuss that diagnosis and potential treatment and how we would bring all this together to help them cope. Sergio, I appreciate you sharing your story with us today, and you'll be a guest on the second part of the podcast to discuss your diagnosis. Sergio, tell us where we can find you.
All social media platforms at Sergio Chicon. That's SergioChicon, as in Nancy.
Sergio Chicon.
Sergio Chicon, yeah.
Sergio, man, I've just butchered your name today.
No, that's okay.
And
know it.
And before we even started, I said, tell me how you say your name. But anyway, we'll get it right eventually. Of course, you can find me at the.brian.com, on Instagram, the.brian. There's a link at the bottom of my website. For all of my social media, feel free to follow us there, and we look forward to having you with us next time. Be sure to check out the second part of this episode, Doc Talks DX, on Patreon. And of course, Doc Talks is a part of the Be Frank Network. Again, thank you for listening to us today. Sergio, it was a pleasure to have you with us, and we're looking forward to being on Doc Talks DX with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.